Please give a warm welcome to the Ones and Twos co-hosts, Adam Tooze and Cameron Abadi.
I've never actually heard that music outside of my ear pod, so that's it. Thank you all for coming out tonight. It's great to see you all. This is a beautiful venue. I should say that for listeners who are not here. So this event is being recorded, and it'll be this week's episode. You all get to be here, hear it as a preview. Everyone else will hear it on Friday as usual. But it is an extraordinary space, which we got to peek at before everyone showed up, and it made me regret that I had not suggested preparing a segment on the economics of bar mitzvahs or something. I went to plenty of bar mitzvahs as a kid, and I was like, economics is definitely part of that.
Something about the gifts, right?
Yeah,
you give big gifts
when I
at
think
bar
about all the
mitzvahs.
gifts that I made out, or my parents ended up funding, I realized we could do a segment, but unfortunately, too late in coming to that idea. So maybe a future episode. But yeah, for now, again, thank you all for coming out. We will do a question and answer session, so you might want to already start thinking about what those questions might want to be. We'll get around to that in a little bit, but first we thought we'd try having a conversation between the two of us up here. And the first topic I wanted to bring up was something actually that was pretty personal, Adam, about you, that I thought we could talk about and try to consider from an economic perspective, as we sometimes do. You are now currently applying for U.S. citizenship, if I understand correctly. So you're in the middle of that process. Worth a round of applause. Obviously, you are currently a citizen of Britain. We've talked about Britain before, but I wanted to talk about this process of U.S. citizenship and applying for that and the economics of that. And I guess maybe first of all, to start off with the question of the motivation for applying for citizenship in the first place. Whether there is an economic motivation for that, whether there's a kind of material motivation that leads you to want to pursue U.S. citizenship, or is it more of a political motivation? And if you look at it as a political motivation, if it's the latter, whether that's more about political rights that you would get as a U.S. citizen, or is it more a question of an emotional benefit you would get, a feeling of attachment that you're expressing by pursuing U.S. citizenship? So yeah, what is the motivation for you in pursuing this?
Yeah, I mean, it's taken me a while. I mean, I've been here since 2009, so I'm overqualified. And I've been married to two Americans, so that also might have qualified me. Except one of them was an anarchist and failed to file her taxes for several years, so then she was no longer eligible as a sponsor.
I should also say,
I swear to God, I was doing my green card application, and somewhere along the line we realized, oh shit, honey, actually, Yale should do it. Because I can't actually sponsor you.
I hope your answer tonight doesn't also get you in trouble here, but
yeah.
I don't know if this will come up in the interview process. But,
I mean,
but go on.
I mean, at some level, it's economic because I've realized I'm never going to live and work anywhere else, than New York and Columbia. I've made a series of decisions recently that have made that clear. And then, to be absolutely honest, it's a more defensive motivation. I mean, I don't know how you feel about being a migrant, and it may feel different in Berlin, because obviously Cam lives in Berlin, and you don't have German citizenship, do you?
I do not, no.
But I have to say that ever since I've gotten here, doing time in New Haven as well. How to put this politely? I don't feel secure around American cops. And it's not because as a white middle-class dude I expect to get arrested, but you kind of never know, to be honest.
What are you doing, Adam? That is.
Well, no, but in New Haven. Well, I don't go on political demonstrations very much. And I know it's excessive, but fundamentally it is to do with an emotion of feeling insecure. Not because anything really bad could happen to me other than being deported to the UK, which would be a total nightmare. But there's this sense of, look, this is where I'm going to make my life. This is where I pay taxes. This is where I am contributing. And yet, ultimately, I have this kind of conditional status here, which is good behavior and not slipping up and not screwing up and having to apply again and again. And what triggered it was I have to apply to renew my green card. And then it's like, why would I do that and end up standing randomly depending on how the border people are deciding on any given airport which line you end up in, because you never know if you're a green card holder, whether you get shuttled off with the tourists on the visa thing, whether you end up with your citizens. And there's this sense of it's a more defensive posture. I mean, your question really made it clear to me. It's not about voting. I mean, live in New York. How much difference is it going to make? So it's about this defensive, protective. I want to have the full rights and protections of an American citizen and not be a migrant in this country. And that's fundamentally what it's about. So it's weird, right? Giving somebody my privilege and everything else, but nevertheless, that's the fundamental motivation is to have that shield of the law and equal standing. And it's a very ambiguous, talk about attachment, it's a very ambiguous choice from that point of view. It's not necessarily something I'm embracing. I'm sorry to those of you who cheered. It was very nice of you to clap. Genuinely, it's really nice, and it's one aspect of American life which I really do appreciate is this logic of immigration and incorporation as part of the American project. And obviously, I am taking advantage of that. But if you asked me emotionally whether that's what it's about, for me personally, it isn't. I'm privileged to be able to take advantage of that offer, which in the US is relatively straightforward and is consensual, and it's not like they're making an exception for you. You've done your 5 years, you're on the green card, you're entitled to citizenship. Why the hell aren't you applying for citizenship is essentially the question. And that's something I do appreciate. But no, if you just ask what's my personal motivation, it really does feel more like this defensive thing of, this is kind of where I'm at, and so I don't want to be in a position where that can be in any way put in question. So I think that's shared by a lot of migrants, to be honest, people who have much more cause than me to worry about this. I don't think the principal reason for applying is to be able to participate in the American political process. I think the principal reason for the vast majority of people who do naturalize is you don't want to be at the mercy of somebody else's bureaucratic decision-making.
Well, in that sense, I mean, that this conversation is only also enabled by the fact that dual citizenship is even permitted, right? I mean, you don't have to give up any other attachments you have.
I would be...
You don't have to...
No, don't misunderstand me. The first day, I'm tempted to throw my UK passport away.
You would be willing to throw away your UK passport.
No, I'm certainly not renewing it. I have that's
where you're unusual.
It goes in the bin.
I think most migrants would be hesitant to give up their attachments to the places they come from. You may be unusual in being so willing.
That is not the motivation.
Okay, no.
And that may be deep down, it's at some deep psychological level why I kind of need to join the American one, because I don't feel attached anywhere else. And so this, in some level, gives me some sort of right to reside in New York, where I do feel incredibly at home, and that is a good...
So if you do have an interview process, I would emphasize that part.
Yes, I will. Don't worry. Yeah.
I wouldn't say I'm purely doing this defensively.
And the citizenship test is great. It's a good one. I quite like the citizenship test.
I guess maybe then the next question that comes to mind is that obviously you do get benefits from being a U.S. citizen. There are obligations, though, as well in becoming a citizen, and maybe U.S. citizenship in particular has particularly onerous obligations or particularly, comparatively pretty heavy ones. The United States is known for being the only country, or one of the only countries, that obliges citizens to pay taxes regardless of where they are in the world, even if they've moved away from the United States.
No, what you have to do is file.
You have to file
You don't
taxes.
have to pay, because double taxation means that if you pay a higher tax rate somewhere else, it's offset against any liability that you have in the US.
I thought that depends. I mean, certainly that's true in my case with Germany, but I always thought that had to do with tax treaties. I don't know if there are tax treaties with every
most
country.
places you go have a tax treaty, so that the problem is not that you have to pay twice over, it's that you have to file every year.
Okay, and yet the United States is unusual in that, right? I mean, that no, other countries don't impose that obligation. Also, a remarkable thing is if you want to get rid of your U.S. citizenship, you also
pay a tax.
You have to pay money to shed U.S. citizenship.
Yeah.
And all of that got me thinking about that U.S. citizenship may be particularly illiberal. Like it's hard to get out of. And while you're in it, you have these obligations that are particularly that follow you around the world. So, are there, when you think about it in those terms, are there citizenships that are better in that sense, in the sense of being more liberal than U.S. citizenship is?
Very few other countries have the tax filing requirement. Apparently, there are only two that I've been able to find. One of them is China, which had to introduce a tax code in the 90s, looked around the world and said, which one are we going to choose? Well, we'll choose the American one. But if you know anything about the Chinese tax system, it's nowhere near as intrusive or demanding as the US tax system. They don't, until very recently, they barely enforce this rule. But notionally, and the other one is Eritrea.
So there you go.
Where any Eritrean, regardless where you live in the world, and Eritrea, let's be clear, is one of the most, it's like North Korea in the Horn of Africa. And they require expats to pay, I think it's either 2 or 3% per annum, on pain of your family being harassed locally in Eritrea, those that are still there. So that's worse. China's at the same level.
Okay.
And I think those are the three that really stand out.
There you go. There's something that unifies Eritrea, China, and United States. There's a piece of trivia there.
Everyone else has a more, so in the UK, for instance, when you leave, you register with the Inland Revenue to say, I'm no longer a tax resident of the UK. Nothing happens. You just say, cheerio, bye-bye. The reason why America presumably needs these more onerous rules is that it has the largest collection of wealthy people in the world. And given half a chance, they'd all take up residence in the Caribbean or something like that, where you don't pay the same sorts of tax. And so not only do you pay currently a filing fee of like $2,400 or something to the State Department, I think, to register, and it's only a few thousand people who do this every year, but you also have these penalty taxes which you have to go on paying for 10 years on assets that there may be lawyers in the room who know this better, but there's a explicit ongoing liability on US-based assets even after you've renounced your citizenship. So they are really going after people. Apparently there was a Facebook founder who shortly after the IPO, renounced his American citizenship. And so there was a whole series of really outrageous moves where people were clearly playing the citizenship game to escape liability, and Congress passed legislation to prevent this. You can see the logic of that, and it's not surprising that it's asymmetric because America has just the greatest concentration of wealth worldwide.
Okay, well, I didn't want to give you any second thoughts about applying for citizenship. I think it is a worthwhile thing, and we'll keep folks updated on how that goes.
How that goes, yes.
Yeah,
if it
exactly.
doesn't work out, you'll hear.
When Adam's getting deported. But actually, that brings me.
Well, I'll move to Berlin, and we'll do the show from there.
That's right. Actually, dual citizenship is now allowed in Germany, so I'll let folks know if and when I apply for German citizenship. But actually, I wanted to now bring up a topic that's in the news in the U.S. It also relates to this topic of migration, and that's specifically the topic of Haitian immigrants in the United States. Obviously, Haitian immigrants have been in the news as a result of the Republican ticket bringing up the topic in the context of allegations that Haitian immigrants are not integrating in the country, specifically in the town of Springfield, Ohio. Pretty lurid stories being spread by the presidential and vice presidential nominees. I wanted to ask simply the very simple question of, from an economic perspective, whether Haitian immigrants are in fact integrating as other immigrant groups do in the United States. Is there any reason to think that process is going any differently? And if so, what is that? What is this scaremongering about Haitian immigrants? Does that tell us something about the concept of economic integration, I guess, to begin with? I mean, is there kind of something surrounding this topic that's inseparable ultimately from race? I mean, I guess I don't want to be too leading about it, but yeah, what do you think about that, Adam?
So, unsurprisingly, it turns out to be total nonsense. Haitian migrants have the same labor market participation ratio essentially as all other migrant populations, which is higher than the native population on average, because migrants tend to be working age adults, and so you have a higher labor market participation. And that's just a statistical fact, widely available to anyone who cares to look it up, and it's not even in dispute. Also, unsurprisingly, Haitian migrants tend to have less formal education, which is they're migrating from one of the most troubled, crisis-torn societies in the Western Hemisphere. Not everywhere in Haiti is like Port-au-Prince, it's worth saying that. And if you meet Haitian people, that's the first question to ask, I've learned, is, are you from Port-au-Prince? Because that's a failed state, Mogadishu type situation, and large parts of the rest of Haiti are actually just poor, but functioning, high functioning, and very stable. But unsurprisingly, given that backdrop, yes, Haitian migrants are in lower positions in the labor market. Their average income is lower than the average migrant to the United States. They tend not to be in managerial positions because they have lower percentages of higher education. There are still universities that function in Haiti, but less than you would expect, say, from, I don't know, the classic case would be Nigerians who have this incredibly overperformance within the migrant population. Is this about race at some level? Yes, clearly. Do I credit either Trump or Vance with enough serious interest in the anti-slavery history of Haiti to understand how significant it is to single Haiti out? I don't think that's what's at stake here. For anyone who's interested in the history of black resistance to slavery, of course, Haiti is the signal case. And I don't think there's any question that historically Haiti has been victimized in part because it's the first free black republic, or first free black state. But I don't think that's what's going on in the heads of, I don't even think we can call it strategy. I think it's just the sort of word salad, the escalating avalanche of nonsense that comes out of that campaign. And I think Vance in particular, if you look at some congressional testimony he was involved in, was looking for an instance where he could show that shock migration caused rent increases. What they really want to go after is the link to inflation, because inflation is the key theme in the anti-Biden campaign. And what they wanted to argue was there's double bad here. The Democrats are terrible on migration and they're terrible on inflation. And look, migration causes inflation, and then you need to find a community in the US where you've seen, it's a natural experiment type logic, a place with a big shock of new migrants in a tight housing market, and that's how Springfield came to the fore, because it actually is a place where that's happened. And then it turned out they're Haitians, and then somebody has a film, somehow there's some shot of some dude with a couple of geese that he's kind of got by the neck, and they turn out to be roadkill that he picked up. And if you know anything about trying to pluck animals and cook them, this guy has got serious culinary skills or knows how to deal with an animal like that, and he's taking them home to eat, and that's what you would do if you saw two dead geese on the street if you're Haitian. Of course, you take them home because they'll make good food, and then this spirals into this insane story. But obviously, it's not incidental that the people involved are black, but I don't think we should impute to them what perhaps comes to our mind when we say Haiti.
Okay, yeah. I mean, at the least, it's historically illiterate in the sense that, yeah, I mean, I guess also how Haiti has been mistreated economically for years and centuries by other countries, by Western colonial powers, et cetera, and France in particular. I mean, none of this obviously comes up in this context. This is, no, this is not part of the presidential campaign. But, yeah, fair enough. Another shift of topic here has less to do with the presidential campaign than something else that's been in the news, namely a report that was issued in Europe about Europe by Mario Draghi. And I was reflecting on this because I've had the feeling that Mario Draghi has actually followed this podcast since its inception. I feel like we've repeatedly talked about Mario Draghi, even one of the very first I think practice podcast that we never even released was about Mario Draghi. For folks who do not know, Mario Draghi is a former central bank leader of the European Central Bank, former prime minister of Italy, had a number of other technocratic jobs in Europe and elsewhere in the West. Most recently, he's been in the news because he just issued a report that went by the title, I have it written down here, EU Competitiveness, Looking Ahead. Pretty dry title, but what it describes pretty basically is that Europe is essentially falling behind. It's falling behind the United States in particular, but also other economic powers. And this is a kind of a call to arms to change Europe's path. And basically, what he describes is European labor productivity has fallen short. It's fallen, European workers are less productive than American workers. And overall, there's been much less private investment in Europe than in the United States. And obviously, we're in the United States right now. And so I guess I thought I would try to put, kind of my US hat on. And if I were to kind of make a patriotic kind of argument from the US side in reading this report, Draghi is saying this is a kind of failure of European governance, but is this not just a story of American success? I mean, is this not a story of American entrepreneurship, of Americans investing well in their own country and being optimistic about the American future, and that's why the kind of investments have been made here and have worked out as well as they have. Why is this about European governance at all, rather than a kind of American business know-how?
So the backstory to this question is that Cam sent me a list of the things he wanted to talk about, and I said, Cam, is it all America all the time because we're doing this in DC? And is there not something else we could talk about? And how about this Draghi report? And if you know the newsletter I put out, it is a kind of kaleidoscope of like Haiti one day, Draghi report the next, cats, geese, dogs the next after that. And so we said, hey, shouldn't we do a question about the Draghi report? And as Cam says, we have form on Draghi. And then I actually did a lunch today in DC, and Cam said, I'll spin it. Like, I'll give it a DC American spin. Like, this is how we're going to work this in. And I swear to God, I did a lunch today at Hopkins at SAIS, and that's exactly
really?
What the opinion on the table was. Does the EU even work at all? Because if I read the Draghi report, the impression I'm getting is, really, you hoity-toity Tooze and your European ways, like you look at this report, nothing seems to work in Europe. So we nailed it.
Okay. My chauvinist stereotype was exactly what you're hearing in DC.
We captured the mood of the city,
okay.
or the town. Like we're on the money here. I mean, Draghi really is an interesting figure because he really is an analog to American people, right? I mean, I always think of him as like the Robert Rubin of the Europe. Like, so that's Clinton's Treasury Secretary, ex Goldman CEO. Draghi did time at Goldman in the 2000s. From a kind of Marxist vantage point, you describe him as like Europe's Gesamtkapitalist, like the guy who sees the overarching interest, not of individual businesses, but of European capital as a whole. What's necessary to make capital accumulation work in a classically one-sided, the interests of business and profit, but on the other hand, a kind of enlightened capitalism, if you like. And I think Draghi is an exponent of that kind of politics. He was legendary as head of the ECB for breaking the impasse during the Eurozone crisis and saying, we need to do whatever it takes. So he becomes the dude who basically stands for massive central bank action, American style. And now he's back. I mean, he was widely rumored to have been in line for the top job at the Commission, and then was a von der Leyen. The German gets the job instead. So instead, his Vade Mecum to the European project is this statement, which is precisely, as you say, really about the failings of capital accumulation, investment, and research in Europe. And is it a story of policy failure? Is it a story of policy failure by contrast with the US? You could say so. And the implied comparison, and there's charts that I excerpted on the newsletter from the report, and there are dozens, it's a great treasure trove of charts, are all comparative with the US and how Europe falls behind. So that isn't the implied message. If you want to drill down on that, I think it's a story about bad macro policy, deflation after 2008, austerity, which is terrible not just at the aggregate level of the economy, but also for private investment, right? It's one of the real misunderstandings of austerity politics is that it's, broadly speaking, good for business. Rarely. Generally speaking, capital accumulation and profit is driven much better with large deficits, and that's something in the United States is really good at. The other line, which I think you'd have to say, is that a key element of that austerity in the European case is a clamp on public expenditure and driven very hard on the German side. And what you also see from Draghi's report is just a shortfall of public investment. You wouldn't believe it, it's surprising in many ways, but Europe's level of public investment as a share of GDP, at least according to the data, is lower than in the US. Yeah, it also kind of takes me about, I can't quite figure out how that works, but that's part of the story. The flip side of this, and where it gets really ambiguous, is that some of you may remember early on in the Biden administration, there used to be a mood, also in this town, that celebrated Europe on the antitrust front. You know, Lena Khan and folks like that, heroes of Biden antitrust, the Brandeis, you know, neo-Brandeisian antitrust school, the hipster version of antitrust. They used in many cases Europe was part of their, implausibly, Europe was their model. And that shows up, you know, domestic flights or short-range flights in Europe are incredibly cheaper than in the US. Cell phones are in much, much cheaper tariffs than in the US. There's a whole bunch of areas in which the Europeans really drank the neoliberal Kool-Aid on competition, took it quite seriously, broke up large oligopolistic formations. And astonishingly, Draghi report goes on to say not to celebrate this as an achievement of efficient markets, but to say, yeah, and as a result, European business makes less profit, there's less price gouging, and as a result of less price gouging, there's less money to invest, and as a result, the Europeans aren't investing, and this is a problem. So from the point of view of the mood of European political economy, it's a really striking fact, I think, to find a chart showing, literally, that profits per subscriber to cell phone companies are about half in Europe what they are in the US. And this is not seen as a success of European policy, but as a failure, because it also means that American investment in broadband and 5G and so on is significantly higher per subscriber than in Europe. And so what this points to is the ambiguity of the strategic choice being implied here, which is essentially Draghi is saying, for the good of competitiveness, for the good of hanging in there with the Chinese and the Americans, Europe needs to stop this rigorous pursuit of tough antitrust and embrace big capital, even at the expense of European consumers, if necessary. So it's a very significant departure from the common sense of European policy in a while. And yeah, very ambiguous. And in a sense, it does imply a kind of concession, at least from this member of the European elite, of the superiority of the American model from the point of view of business accumulation, profit, and he would argue from the point of view of the long-run development of labor productivity.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the other question that came to mind when I looked at the report was, and I guess this is not one that you would hear maybe in your meetings in DC, but what's so bad about stagnation anyway? I mean, if Europe falls behind China and America, like, it's still pretty pleasant over there, right? I mean, what's so bad about stagnating a bit?
We should really do an episode. There was a big report from one of the trade union associated think tanks in Berlin, IWK, on this issue of the standard of living comparison between Europe and the US. Because indeed, like, it's not obvious that it's not obvious that the more work-driven, productivity-orientated American model, it doesn't deliver better life expectancy, it doesn't deliver a whole bunch of other outcomes which are improved. It's quite one-dimensional as a sign, and I think it is one of the more regrettable elements of the current reconfiguration of economic policy discourse around competitiveness, around industrial jobs, around the geopolitics of industrial policy, that we've really gone back, and in the words of Jake Sullivan, quite explicitly back to this sort of quite macho kind of vision of national industrial strength as the central benchmark of economic policy success. I'm not saying it's the only one, but it has acquired a new salience. And it's enough sometimes to make you wish for Larry Summers to kind of come back and pour some water over this, because it's pretty superheated in this town right now.
To shift back to the presidential campaign a bit, I wanted to ask about Kamala Harris and her campaign and her economic platform. And it struck me recently in the debate and otherwise in the campaign that she has sort of, she's pitching her economic platform under a new banner, namely the opportunity economy. And I wanted to ask what you make of the kind of the ideological content of that banner. I mean, on one hand, it strikes me that it could be pretty vacuous. I mean, like, who's against opportunity, right? I mean, opportunity is a kind of, if you look at it abstractly, is something that doesn't necessarily even mean very much. But I guess more concretely, if you look at it, it struck me that it could also have a pretty conservative valence. I mean, if anything, it struck me, reminded me of this phrase from George W. Bush's presidency, the ownership economy, and like in the policies that Kamala Harris is pitching under this idea involve helping small businesses getting off the ground, owning your own small business, owning your own home, being an important part of her economic message, and how she would help with down payments for homes. There are all sorts of slogans, it strikes me, that a platform from the left could take up, whether it's sort of solidarity, equality, dignity. She's gone with opportunity here, and I'm curious what you make of that, again, from an ideological perspective.
Yeah, strange coming from the daughter of a notorious Marxist, right? Who's obviously a Marxist herself,
as we've learned, yeah.
As we learn,
from Donald Trump, yeah.
I've really, this question really, I found myself surprised by my own reaction to your question, because I kind of want to defend the Kamala Harris camp, which is not necessarily where I would expect to find myself. So I'm not sure. I mean, it may be linked to the last answer, which is that I find it a little refreshing at this point to have a more solid emphasis in the Harris-Walz campaign on American domestic social issues. I actually think that's where a progressive economic and social policy should be concentrated. Now, let's talk about the opportunity as the tagline for that. But stepping back from the industrial competition with China kind of line and the incredible heavy emphasis on Inflation Reduction Act and CHIPS Act and all that kind of stuff as the central banners of the Biden camp, I think that's what accounts for my reaction here. Because I would say that opportunity is not a vacuous policy objective in the United States. I mean, it has a very concrete meaning. Let's connect it essentially to social mobility, or the lack of it in the United States. And right now, broadly speaking, if you're born into poverty, you have a 1 in 2 chance of living the rest of your life as an adult as poor. And that is 3 times higher than in well-organized, sophisticated European societies. So compare the United States with Denmark and your what's called the poverty elasticity. So your chances of being poor if you start poor are 3 times higher in the US than they are in Denmark, 3 times. And of course, America has far more poverty than Denmark to start with. So the combination of persistent inequality down to the level of poverty in the United States with, at this point, diminished social mobility chances, or very disappointing social mobility chances, makes an obvious target for policy. So that's what I think opportunity should be read as. It's just another word for social mobility. Is that a conservative value? Well, you could say it was, because it's a story to some extent of individual uplift, and there's obviously a paradox involved in this. And if you focused entirely on bank credit, home ownership, and so on, I think it would have an entirely negative, it would have an entirely an entirely conservative valence. But if you focus instead on child poverty and child care, which are huge drivers of disadvantage for single parents, above all single mothers, and large parts of the young population of this country, it seems to me to be exactly where progressive policy was from 2018 onwards with the first version of the Green New Deal and the original incarnation of Build Back Better, and where we didn't end up, thanks to the ghastly congressional politics of the first phase of the Biden administration, thanks to Manchin, essentially, who whittled down the large package that was a broadly based project of social transformation for this country and reduced it to an essentially quite conservative, quite nationalistic industrial policy package, which is what the Inflation Reduction Act and CHIPS are. So I think this is, I'm surprised myself in how positively this sits with me. And I think it's for that reason that it marks a move from this 1950s, 60s style kind of, well, it isn't really 60s because Great Society was in the 60s, but this industrial policy focus to a much more broad-based focus on what really are, profound problems. Social scientists call it the problem of social reproduction. And the United States, for very large numbers of people in this society, really does face very serious, almost crisis-like problems at the level of just this basic process of reproducing, of having children, of raising a family, of achieving any kind of personal progression.
Yeah, I mean, again, just to clarify, I understand this is a presidential campaign, and there's reasons why you would use, you'd find terms that appeal to the most possible people, and I think if she were to use more Marxist terms, it wouldn't come across as well. And social reproduction is also something that's probably harder to sell in a presidential campaign than opportunity. I get that point, but
Walter's line is good. What's one person's socialism and is another person's neighborliness, or whatever.
There you go.
That's a good bait and switch.
There you go. Yeah. Yeah, if you're looking, maybe we can serve as consultants for
Oh, swear to God, across this place, folks are lining up. It's extraordinary. Yeah. Question was asked at lunch as well. No, absolutely. I mean, it's like American politics is fascinating that way. People jostling for position, thinking about their location. No one really has a plan for the Trump administration. I don't know anyone who's really gaming that at the policy level in a very serious way. There are people who are, I'm sure, but not the folks that I spend time with. No. There are a bunch of think tanks which obviously have to position themselves for both contingencies, and you can see some very interesting moves from like Michael Pettis and folks like that, who are now being consulted by Robert Lighthizer on trade policy. There is a bridge between the two parties on protectionism. There is a bridge on industrial policy. Yeah. There was a lot of excitement about Vance and the blue-collar, GOP thing until he went weird, or was weird all the time and just showed his hand. But no, there really is this jostling for position on, at least advising the transition. So it's a reasonable aspiration.
Every slogan has some sort of policy behind it. There are people working on policies. That's always, even American Carnage, there's some policies behind it somewhere. But I did want to ask quickly about a few swing states in this coming election. and the economics behind them. Obviously, some states matter more than others. We've covered a few in the podcast in the last few weeks. I thought I'd try to get a few more in here while we're in DC. First of all, Pennsylvania, very big swing state. This election could come down to Pennsylvania. One question I've always had about Pennsylvania, maybe others have as well, is whether Pennsylvania is a state that belongs to the Midwest, or is it part of the Northeast? And if you were to look at it from like the economics of the state, like where does it actually line up? Where would one assign it if you looked at it purely economically?
Yeah, this swing state phenomenon is mind-blowing. I mean, when you try and communicate it to the outside world, that, yeah, the fate of global politics hinges on these states. And then within these states, it hinges on like 6 counties in these states. And it specifically hinges on whether, you know, suburban mums or, you know, soccer dads or whatever will show up to vote for the candidate. It's a hard thing to convey the logic of. But it's also fascinating because it drives like this attention, and it's supposed to do that, right? It's supposed to give the local influence over the national, or indeed, in this case, the global. And so, yeah, it's absolutely true right now that, for instance, the global strategy of a giant Japanese steel maker, Nippon Steel, which is trying to buy US steel, which is really, in a sense, doing US Steel a favor, you could say. Nippon Steel has its own reasons for wanting to buy US Steel, but not a lot of other people want to bid a lot of money on that company. The strategy of that company is basically hanging in the balance. Why? Because Pennsylvania. It's all about those, what is it, I think 15, is it 15 votes in the Electoral College? Something like that, and that's the swing you need. Alan Beattie of the FT, who if you don't read regularly is really one to savor a classic British wit, simply remarked, yeah, lie back and think of Pennsylvania as when it comes to that US Steel deal. It's fascinating, yeah. If you look at the economic and social history of Pennsylvania, it does appear to split coastal Philadelphia, the strip that belongs basically in the giant conurbation that goes from Boston all the way to DC. And then inland, there is the other Pennsylvania that is essentially part of the Midwest logic, has its own industrial capital in the form of Pittsburgh, and this creates this sort of dichotomy within the state. And I thought, okay, I'm going to see this in the electoral numbers. So I tried to get like figures on and data on the electoral map of Pennsylvania. And when you do that, you actually see something totally different, right? Which is that basically the entire state is red, except Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Harrisburg. And I don't want to do violence to the geography of Pennsylvania, but otherwise the map is really basically red. Far fewer people live, of course, in the rural areas of Pennsylvania than in those 3 cities. I believe in terms of registered voters, the Democrats are ahead in Pennsylvania because they have huge registrations in Philadelphia, for instance. But who knows how that plays out? It's a very close race in terms of electoral victories. And it's a very interesting state from the point of view of the issues we were just talking about with Kamala Harris's agenda. And I didn't appreciate, I've been in Philadelphia plenty of times, but I didn't understand Philadelphia's unique position as the poorest of the big 10 cities in the United States. I just didn't register how severe that issue is. If you look, because you might think of Pennsylvania and Appalachia, it's bordering, this is maybe a West Virginia type story. No. The highest rate of poverty in the state of Pennsylvania is in Philadelphia. And amongst children in Philadelphia, relatively recently, it was high as 37% poverty rate. So this is a remarkably configured economic and political unit that is divided in several different ways. The principal line seems to be urban and non-urban. The cities are squarely democratic. And Philadelphia, at least, is a remarkable case of an American city in, not crisis, because obviously Philadelphia gets on with life and carries on. It's not like this sense of, but in a very profound level, it's a profoundly troubled urban space to an extent that I hadn't clocked the scale of that issue. I mean, you see it in northern Philadelphia as you come through with the train, but the statistics are dramatic.
I would not suggest this is messaging for either campaign either. Yeah, the troubled state of Pennsylvania. But to shift to another state, Arizona, which remarkably, as I was looking at reading about Arizona right now, it is booming in contrast to what you're describing in Pennsylvania. It has, I think, record GDP growth, record low unemployment, record boom in manufacturing jobs, and yet the state seems kind of discontent. It seems like after having voted for the Biden administration, it seems like it could likely turn Republican. I'm curious whether all of these positive statistics in the state, whether they're attributable to things that the Biden administration did, and then how to make sense of this kind of lingering unhappiness there that amid all of this.
I mean, I'm not going to attempt to kind of read Arizona politics. It's like, but the economic numbers are absolutely, again, like these questions you ask are like really interesting. I had no idea, but it's like close to 5% GDP growth per annum since 21. So like it's a huge leap forward. And I don't think there's any question at all that the Arizona is probably in the sweet spot. And it has basically been the beneficiary of all of the Biden agenda. The chips investments there are huge. They're going better than many people thought. I was once those who kind of rather contemptuously perhaps thought that it just wouldn't be possible to build out very high quality chip production in the United States. They're proving that to be false. The build out is going far better than many people expected. Early stages, we're not yet into large scale bulk production, but the early testing of these hyper complex chip facilities are much better. And so it may end up, I guess, if you read it this way, as being one of the test cases of the failure of that model of, the theory of change, which was that you pile in these investments from the federal government and you create a shift in the complexion of states. I mean, a lot of people, I think, of Ohio as being one of the examples where they attempted to do this. It may turn out that Arizona is, in fact, the test case. Maybe folks in the Q&A afterwards can illuminate for us what the political motivations of discontent in Arizona might be. But from an economic point of view, it's hard to think of any part of the U.S. which is growing more rapidly. Apparently, Tucson's different. Like it's not growing at the same rate as Phoenix. I got as far as that, but that can hardly explain the polling.
Worked in Arizona is the point.
In terms of economic growth, it really appears to have done so. Yeah.
Well,
7 million people. It's not a huge place, but
I'll ask about one more state, but then after that, I'd like to turn it to the audience for questions. So you can line up at these microphones. We'll take as many questions as we can, please do bring up anything that is on your mind. But one last state I wanted to ask about. That is the state of Georgia. Was a swing state last time. Looks likely to be again. One thing as I was reading about Georgia that was remarkable is that the movie industry, the film industry, is booming in Georgia. This partly as a result of public policy there, very clearly. Like they've offered 30% tax credits for any film productions happening there, and it looks set to continue to grow. And I was wondering whether, we think of the film industry as kind of this liberal, industry based in California. We associate it with liberal cultural mores, and I guess by extension with liberal economic ideas maybe then as well. But if the movie industry were to be based in a different part of the country, if it were based in the Deep South, if it were based primarily in Georgia, is it, possible that the film industry would itself become a conservative industry? I mean, like, is that a conceivable thing, or is the kind of economic ideas that we associate with that industry sort of internal or external to the industry, I guess, to put it that way.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I didn't, again, it's like one of these things, your questions turn up for me that I didn't really understand. Is that Georgia really is, next to Hollywood, the big film production center of the US, and there are years in which Georgia actually claims more feature films under production than California, which is mind-blowing to me. I just didn't know that. And it is indeed the result of rather aggressive tax-cutting benefits provided by the state government, which is very dramatic in its scale. It's also a non-union state. So it's a good place if you're trying to escape the highly unionized California production system. So I think those two things are really playing in hard. I'd quibble a little bit in two ways. I mean, a bit like in Pennsylvania, there are places in Georgia, though it may be deep south, which are quite liberal. So Savannah, for instance, is a liberal town by any stretch of the imagination. It has a big arts college. It can easily sustain a kind of creative community in an island of liberalism within an otherwise conservative cultural setting. So I think that's also something we have to recognize about the spottiness, if you like, of the American map. As much as we paint entire states red or blue, there are these huge differences, a bit like New York State as well. Like upstate New York is a very profoundly conservative political culture. So that's a first qualifier. And I think the second one, and again, like I learned a lot by trying to think about your question, is Hollywood, because Hollywood's politics swing like massively back and forth over time, and also they split. So Hollywood isn't a monolith. So if you go all the way back to like Birth of a Nation or something like that, right? Hollywood is the purveyor of a white supremacist, reconciled, post-Civil War narrative in which, endorsed by people like Woodrow Wilson, which solidifies America around an anti-black, reconciled narrative of the Civil War, heralding the Ku Klux Klan into the 1920s. So that's also Hollywood. And in the 20s, especially MGM, right, becomes this bastion of Republican-aligned, pro-Harding, normalcy, which is essentially a very conservative regime. And then a whole ethics code, because, you know, some of the early Hollywood films are very racy. There's quite a lot of very explicit sexuality, drug-taking, debauchery of all kinds. All of that, there's a board that is trying to drive this out. And so that kind of rumbles through into the McCarthy period, right? And it's internal to the culture, right? It's the big bosses at MGM that are driving this purge. And then on the other hand, in the Great Depression era, you have Warner Brothers who are making all of these socially conscious movies, which we also know, if you like your black and white 1930s, 40s, 50s, 40s films, there's an awful lot of Popular Front, New Deal aligned. There were, after all, quite a lot of left-aligned, not to say communists, in the Hollywood system who had then to be purged out by the McCarthyists in the 50s, right? So there's this swing back and forth, and the Hollywood of the 30s and 40s is not straightforwardly conservative or progressive. And then through the Cold War period, if you think of somebody like Ronald Reagan comes out of the studio system, so California is not just a spawn of liberalism, it's also a breeding ground of particular strains of American conservatism, all the way down, after all, to Arnold Schwarzenegger and that entire line. I think it's a relatively recent phenomenon that you get this quite, amongst those who articulate political positions, a predominance of liberalism. Still now, an awful lot of very unpolitical filmmaking, or at least notionally, it's not conveying a strong message. So it's, I think rather than a fact of history, I think we should think of this identification of Hollywood and the business of filmmaking with left politics, or liberal politics, better. I mean, it's in and itself like a projection of the conservative culture warriors who see in Hollywood the Guardians, Hawleys and people like this, who see them as essentially kowtowing to the CCP, tailoring their output to the needs of the Chinese censors, conjuring up this whole image of a kind of hegemonic American liberalism that silences all conservative voices. I think we should take that with a pinch of a pinch of salt. And maybe Georgia is a new model. I don't.
No, you're making me think Georgia's more liberal than Hollywood. I don't. Yeah, I mean, I don't even now. I don't know why I think of Hollywood as liberal at all. Yeah, No, I don't. I've honestly forgotten. I don't know.
But there's really interesting. What I was really struck by recently was the Nashville Bitcoin conference. I mean, that was really fascinating. Talking about because Bitcoin, the crypto people find California there's some Californian thing. There's a Californian liberalism within which Hollywood has a place, within which big tech has a place, which conservatives find really creepy. And I think they definitely want alternatives to that. And Nashville is a really interesting hub of that counter-liberal modernity, like as a tech hub, as a cultural hub. And most recently, this is where Trump staged his conversion to crypto. On the Nashville crypto stage.
Yeah, Nashville is not a swing state. It also got me. I hope this all makes sense for our international listeners. You mentioned that
they're following all over the world. You get people. I think people want to know more about swing states.
I don't. I was just asking myself. I don't know how you say swing state in German. I don't even know. How do you translate swing state? Do you know the term swing state in German? I don't know. Yeah.
I think they actually use the phrase swing
state. They just say it with a German accent. Swing state.
Swing state.
I don't know. Anyway, we should turn to questions from all of you now. Please, again, if you line up the microphones, we'll alternate a bit. We'll take as many questions as we can. But we'll start then here, please.
When you brought up probably the failed purchase of U.S. steel by Nippon Steel, it reminded me of when you were speaking about the Green Marshall Plan a few episodes back about how the historical vanity of kind of American industrial policy. And I was wondering, what's your take on, because theoretically, Nippon acquiring U.S. steel and I guess building out this industrial bygone should be like a tagline for kind of Jake Sullivan and Biden's kind of friendshoring, anti-Chinese, de-risking strategy, so to speak. So I want to hear more about your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, this really is, that's why it's such an acid test. I completely agree. You would think that a kind of merging of a relatively decrepit American heavy industrial producer into a far more competitive Japanese steel producer, when Japan is such a key element in the alliance which people like Kurt Campbell have been trying to stitch together. I mean, Japan has always been the American hawk's play in East Asia, right? Far more so than South Korea, which is a much more problematic ally, but the LDP in Japan is solid, straight down the line, Cold War ally, and to be embarrassing them in this way is utterly shocking. And literally with I think they put Lael Brainard, like a serious technocrat. I think they required her to go out and say the president views U.S. steel as an important component, as it was in World War II, of the arsenal of democracy. And for that reason, I mean, the embarrassment. I mean, seriously, but that it goes back to this like clinging to faded mantle. When America has huge strengths in all sorts of key areas, as the Draghi reports hammers home relentlessly. They do not need to be clinging to steel as a strategic asset, and yet it was literally declared a heritage, in a sense, heritage component of the arsenal of democracy. It's because it's Pennsylvania. I think that it comes down to that. And people on the inside of the administration will say, Nippon screwed up. They should really have gone to the United Steelworkers Union first, and they failed diplomatically to involve key constituencies for the Biden administration. And so it's their own fault for having ended up in this situation. But you can forgive them, I think, for their dismay and puzzlement at what's going on.
I think once you're a U.S. citizen, your tune will change. You'll be...
Oh, yeah, of course.
You'll be,
sorry.
You'll be.
Yeah, I'll feel I have to defend my steel works.
And I think a lot of this issue comes down to the fact that this company happens to be literally be called U.S. Steel. It's called U.S. Steel.
No, we shouldn't
It's like
underestimate. It was a huge deal. It was, if you read Alfred Chandler's business histories, this really is an icon of American industrialism, like VW in Germany right now, which is also in serious trouble. But nevertheless, it's Japan. I totally agree. It's like, this is where you prove that friendshoring means something.
Next question, please.
Hi there. I'm sure you saw today that there were pager explosions across Lebanon, and the current reporting is that they think that bombs were placed in the pagers, and I saw it described as, quote, supply chain weaponization. And my question is that a vindication of the U.S. national security reshoring? Not too long ago, people were mocking the United States for fears about Huawei telecom tech or Chinese EVs shutting off. But because of this recent event, do you think that this school of thought is either going to gain a lot of ground or be vindicated or something of that sort? Thank you.
Can China put bombs in our phones? I think is what we want.
I'm going to go out on the limb here and say that I don't think that Huawei phones come with explosive devices triggered at the behest of the NSS. I don't think that's the case. Lebanon's a super. It's hard to hear up here, but we're talking Lebanon here,
yes,
right?
the Lebanon, the pager explosions.
So we're talking Secret Service activity where these things have been manipulated. I think that's the short answer. I don't think an incident like this, in a situation as extreme as Lebanon, with agencies involved in the way that they are, is very telling about the broader issue of supply chains. I think the issue that you raise about how seriously we should take supply chains is an intensely serious one, and it's important to bring it up. I honestly suspect, again, a fair degree of bad faith in many of the argumentations around this. And in the end, I think almost all of them boil down to various types of protectionist logic, which aren't a million miles removed from the US Steel case. The British spent a lot of time with GCHQ working very hard on Huawei's equipment in particular, testing it, trying to find whether there were backdoors. And I think their overwhelming impression was, and this appears to be true for the latest generation of chips, is that it's done in a hurry and it's really buggy. And any Secret Service in its right mind could break into Huawei equipment, whether it was US or Chinese. And from that point of view, it was probably it was insecure, but it wasn't, as it were, it wasn't particularly designed to enable Chinese entrapment or Chinese break-ins. Any mildly sophisticated intelligence service could break into this equipment. I think the jury's out on whether the stories about EVs really amount to anything more than that. And again, these are sophisticated global players, the Chinese companies involved. If you sit down with them in the same way as the Chinese sit down with Tesla and say, okay, we need a full open disclosure of the bugs and the technology you've got in this kit, and if you don't show it to us, we will do it ourselves, and then we will expose your bad faith. Most of those actors, if they're seriously interested in market share, will come to terms with you. Their main worry will be what kind of penalty they pay at home if they're seen to be collaborating with you. And several American firms have decided these sorts of games are not worth playing out in the Chinese market and have eventually pulled back. So I think preemptive concerns about how these logics of mutual suspicion will play out will in the end cause successive disentangling of these networks in many cases. In the German case, the case of VW, I think we're going to see a kind of segmentation of the company with a Chinese-centered branch which does Chinese goods for Chinese markets, if they can indeed still find a market there. So the issue is real. It's taken very, very seriously at the policy level. I think we're yet to see a case of the large-scale exploitation of widely used technology, certainly their technology in our case, which has been to the detriment of security in the West. The hypothesis is not unreasonable. It just doesn't so far seem to be substantially there's not much evidence for it on the ground.
I think it would be wise to maybe take a few questions
Yeah.
at a time to make sure we get to as many or all of them. So maybe we'll go for 3 or
Yeah.
Okay, please. So let's start here and then.
Do you believe that the development of artificial systems as smart or smarter than humans poses strong national security or geopolitical or existential risks? And regardless of that, what should the US and international community's policy be towards this coming technology?
And then please, you.
It's a fun one. Sort of regarding the Draghi report and what you guys were saying about that earlier, I've recently been thinking, as I think sort of everyone has, about the German economy, and although it's not European as such anymore, the British economy. And since Keir Starmer has come into power and Reeves has announced all these plans, but then also committed to basically having a balanced budget, they're talking about a sovereign wealth fund without any real tax raises or deficit spending. Olaf Palme came into office with this promise to build, I think, 3 million homes. That obviously is wildly off track and basically impossible if you're not going to do massive spending projects. I don't see any real economic explanation for this, so I was wondering if there's a cultural explanation for why the British and the Germans and the sort of Europeans in general are so averse to deficit spending.
This ties into that one well. So you often hear in Europe the issue is a kind of lack of shared economic culture, and I think a lot of that you could say comes down to like lack of shared economic memories or narratives in the same way that the US has, right? It might be kind of facile how the history of the 30s and 40s is used, but we kind of have these reference points, the New Deal, the Marshall Plan, Arsenal of Democracy, that kind of like grease the rhetorical wheels when you're trying to do big fiscal stimulus. To the extent that even like European progressives will often use American history to try to justify their policies. So my question would be, if you could take one event in European economic history and kind of embed that into the consciousness or the sort of societal memory of Europe to try to, take Europe in the more Keynesian direction that you'd prefer, what would that be? Like, what would be the best kind of reference point, even if the history is a little fuzzy, even if it's a little mythologized?
Okay, sorry for leaning forward in this weird way, but I am finding it really hard to understand people speaking. I can hear the sound, but I can't. I'll try and answer those questions in reverse order, in part because the AI question rather stumps me. But it's already happened, and the collective memory moment in Europe is of the Eurozone crisis, and it's quite powerful, and it works on policy, and we've seen it in action already. In what I'm referring to is the way that the EU responded to the COVID shock of 2020. I mean, it initially looked as though it was going to fail again, and then it didn't. And part of the political argumentation and part of the reason why is that neither the French nor the Germans wanted to repeat what they understand as the failures of the 2010s. In other words, the Eurozone crisis, the treatment of Greece and the other peripheral so-called debtors. And so there we already have a kind of a bootstrapping of history and the process of historical learning with regard to a specific reference point. The problems of both the notionally progressive governments of both Germany and the UK with debt are indeed, I mean, the British case is despairing. It really does seem as though, because for many of us, the Corbyn experiment, the left leadership of the Labour Party, was an ambiguous thing. For me as a European, it was quite difficult to stomach Corbyn's track record. But the very least you could say is that the Treasury team around John MacDonald was smart, and they understood modern macro. They even had a kind of MMT infatuation for a while. They were thinking in really serious and interesting ways about how to finance a big green investment push in the UK. And as much as Starmer initiated a conservative turn in the Labour Party, the extent to which the Reeves team have doubled down gratuitously on the bizarre, the householder analogy, really just the repertoire of conservative tropes around public finance is staggering and profoundly disappointing. And I think the only way to explain it essentially is as a kind of, again, it's policy learning, but basically they decided that it was the September disaster that of the Tory party's fiscal policy that handed them the huge, insuperable, like polling lead. And so the lesson from that is you just do very conservative fiscal policy, and that's how you secure your grip on power. In the German case, with fairness to both the Greens and the SPD, that's not the story, because in fairness to both the Greens and the SPD, they were the parties, in the SPD's case, Olaf Scholz was the finance minister who did the great deal in 2020 on Next Gen EU. They embarked on programs that were going to be funded from, it's a silly hypothecation device where you create a fund and then you use that to pay for a specific thing. But it was a way of getting around the German debt brake, they thought. And they'd found a compromise with the Liberals who they were in coalition with. And that's just unraveled on them. And it's unraveled on them not because the SPD and the Greens changed their minds, but because the court ruled the way that it did, the German Supreme Court, and the Liberals have just played a really dirty inside game in sabotaging the coalition over spending. So I think that the logic is slightly different in the two cases, and I have to say that the unfolding story of the Starmer government in the UK at this point still somewhat mystifies me, and I think it mystifies a lot of friends and comrades in the UK as well who just we don't quite understand what happened, because there's various ways of justifying and motivating a conservative fiscal policy, but the Reeves people seem determined to adopt the lowest common denominator of fiscal conservative populism. AI, I don't know the answer to your question about whether or not in the end, further iterations of AI will pose really fundamental questions to political theory. Cam, maybe you have a view. But I think it's important to say we don't know, which means I'm not saying yes, I'm not saying no. I don't think what we've seen so far does pose fundamental questions. You might say that some of the action in the Ukraine war has an ominous kind of feel to it of the move increasingly towards various types of autonomous targeting. It's rumored that the IDF is using that kind of technology as well, very, very rapid decision-making cycles. Potentially, this certainly could, right? It's very hard to deny that possibility. I don't think we're there yet. And the way the conversation is going, as I understand it, is that the chances of a kind of collective arms embargo or arms control agreement between China and the US on this kind of terrain is minimal. That is not something that is likely to transpire. Have you, do you have
I would say
settled views?
I feel like when we've discussed this in the past, it's still, it always strikes me that we're still, that we're still in the early stages, ultimately. I mean, that there's speculation about where it could lead, but there's a kind of, it's sort of all tied up with, ultimately with some level of hype about what artificial intelligence can and will be. So, I mean, I think disentangling this kind of, that potential and the kind of abstract ideas about it from where we actually are right now is important, because maybe as it continues to develop, that will make the kind of arms control ideas more concrete when we get closer to that being a reality. But I don't know. It's sort of as week for week when we discuss things, it's like sometimes strikes me just how much hype there is on so many topics, and this is one of those where it's hard to sort of tell what is theoretical from what is currently actual, But that's not necessarily an answer directly to the question either, I guess. I am mindful of the time. I mean, I know we still have some questions. How many do you think we can take at once here?
Let's do 4 this
Okay, so we'll go with 4, 2 and 2, please. And please, let's keep them as succinct as possible. We are obviously mindful of time.
So I think one of the topics that's resonated with us as an audience is Europe And you guys are talking about how there's a lot of failure and a lot of things going on there that aren't looking good. And Europe has, and the EU has traditionally been a strong US ally and a buffer for the US. So with the way the world is shaping up right now, in the next 10 years, what do you think is more important for the US from both an economic and national security perspective? Either building up and uplifting the EU or our allies and our relationships with countries in the South China Sea?
Please.
Hi. Here in Washington, D.C., we are home to a number of international organizations, the World Bank and International Monetary Fund being two of them. I'm curious what you think is the future of these organizations in a changing, geopolitical global climate.
If possible, to have at least one woman ask
Yes,
the question.
we have one woman waiting online, so let's give her a shot to come up front. Thank you.
We were simply reflecting the lineup of people, but it's important. Thank you for.
It is. Appreciate that. Apologies for my raspy voice here, but Adam, in talking up the top about the Draghi report, you synthesized by saying the EU is, quote, so far behind the U.S. You also tangentially mentioned the IRA. Off the back of that, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on the EU versus U.S. efforts to scale up a clean hydrogen economy, and more specifically, the IRA introduced, as I'm sure you know, a lucrative clean hydrogen production tax credit, 45V, the most lucrative in the history of the world, up to $3 per kilogram of hydrogen. But the Treasury's draft regs deviated from Congress's technology-neutral intention, mirroring the EU's renewable-only model. And given the lack of success in scaling up the industry on both sides of the pond, what advice might you give U.S. policymakers, specifically at Treasury and DoD in particular, to truly accelerate the U.S. hydrogen economy? And should they perhaps maybe prioritize flexibility in clean hydrogen production regs to qualify for the tax credit? Sorry, mouthful.
Yeah, thank you. So why don't we take everyone who's still standing up?
Let's first two. Yeah.
Just very quickly, you talked about the urban-rural divide in U.S. politics, and I was generally wondering what you think is the biggest cause of that, because that divide where the cities are more liberal hasn't always necessarily been the case everywhere.
Wait, can you? Yeah, I honestly did miss the beginning of that too. Yeah.
Oh, you talked a lot about the urban-rural divide in U.S. politics, and what do you think is the biggest cause of that, where the cities are more liberal?
We have the EU and the rest of the world. We have hydrogen. We have urban-rural.
What was the second question? This is where it gets tricky. World Bank, IMF. What was the?
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
An easy one then, but first can I say, as someone who's currently in the process of renewing their green card, I know exactly what you've been going through. Question, I'm just fascinated about how much research goes into each episode for the podcast, because clearly you know a hell of a lot about a lot of things, but you can't know about everything. And what springs to mind is episodes where you focus on an industry like perfume or chocolate, and I think, is it something you've just been, do a deep dive through Wikipedia and its sources? Are you going really deep beyond that into economic reports on industries that we might never find as members of the public? Thank you.
Final question here.
This question actually comes from my girlfriend who's sitting down. But you mentioned how the film industry is proliferating in Georgia and how in some ways it's more liberal than Hollywood. But what do you think about how the film industry in Atlanta has relationships to the development of the Cop City project? For example, Shadowbox Studios owns a large plot of forest land bordering the Cop City site where it is planning to build a massive new studio complex. Thank you.
Oh, God.
Okay.
The answer is I don't know. And that's also part of the answer to the next question, which is we really don't know everything about everything.
Yeah,
we genuinely and totally don't. And I had no idea that the Atlanta studio complex was associated with Cop City.
No.
No.
Yeah, this that question about how we pull together this podcast every week. I mean, sometimes I do think we need to have a proviso saying, like, that we that we are, that you are not an expert on everything, but we try our best. We do double check our facts. Everything is true that we say on the podcast, but but it's remarkable. Yeah, obviously, you should maybe tell a little more about how you do the research.
The spirit is not that of. The spirit surely is more that of, okay, smart people, we all are, trying to figure the world out, giving a certain amount of time to trying to do that figuring out, being led by the questions of a good friend who's saying, hey, we should think about this, and then you go away and you have a think about it and you do some reading, and it does definitely go beyond Wikipedia, I promise. And it really varies, and some things I have a lot of deep background knowledge on, and some I don't. But it's more this, kind of like and we go back and forth on what questions we're going to ask.
It's not, I guess maybe that's another way of putting this, I don't think what we do is meant to be the final word on anything.
Right.
And I think that's the spirit in which it's undertaken, and I think it's supposed to be, maybe the start to thinking about all of these topics, and that is, I think, the animating idea. I think that's generally, one could say, true about journalism in general, right? I mean, it's not when you read a given article on any subject, it's sort of like part of conversation. It's not the final word.
Yeah, exactly. I think that is thinking of it as conversation. I mean, the interaction is rather structured. This is not like one of those chatty podcasts, but de facto, we go back and forth. We agree what the questions are, what the themes are going to be. And then I do think of it as a kind of guided search. And that has worked really well. We're always open, of course, to listeners just saying, hey, you've got this completely wrong. You did this the wrong way around. We got a lot of really embarrassing commentary on the Tour de France episode. It's like I really got hammered on Twitter for making outrageous claims about how bicycle wheels are changed.
Fair enough.
And apparently, apparently they aren't. But what they do is I can't even remember. But there's something I can't. You don't change the wheel. I think they can change the front wheel, but not the back wheel. Anyway, it was, we got schooled on that. But okay, let's kind of bend back to some of the other issues that were at stake. The international institutions, the World Bank, IMF, I think they're in real trouble. I really do, and I've had conversations with them at an extremely high level, and I just don't think they can get past the fact that fundamentally their institutions rooted in World War II, in the aftermath of World War II, and to rebalance them to match the world economy now would require a fundamental reweighting of share and voice in the institutions, and the American Congress and the United States will not wear it. And as such, they're basically deadlocked. And there are lots of different ways of kind of imagining that you can work your way around this, but none of them are really adequate to the situation, and the leadership know it, and they're not as defunct as the WTO, and they still play an important role in key moments, and they're very powerful mechanisms of discipline, as we're seeing, but are they the kind of financial architecture that we would want for the complex multipolar world that we're currently in? They really aren't, and I don't see any way in which they could be. Help me out here. It's been a super long day. This is like
hydrogen.
Hydrogen.
Yeah,
Thank you. Hydrogen. Yeah. So
the IRA law, and basically, it's remarkable that all the discussion of the IRA law and this entire presidential campaign has come down to both fracking and its support of industries like hydrogen. But yeah, this is.
So, I mean, we've done hydrogen on the show, and I'm broadly speaking not a hydrogen negator or denier, but I am a hydrogen skeptic. I don't see hydrogen playing anything like the dominating role in the green energy transition that hydrogen boosters claim for it. Now, this doesn't mean that hydrogen isn't going to play a significant role in the US transition, because the United States, as a result of its very, very serious role in the global fossil fuel economy, which is only getting more serious by the day, actually has in the Gulf and in Texas the most advanced hydrogen infrastructure in the world. So if anyone is going to do it, There's really more criticism leveled at the Germans, who are barking, I think, completely up the wrong tree. But in the US case, it really matters. The risk in what you're proposing, namely to lighten up on the regulations, because the claim, the fundamental issue here is you pass the piece of legislation, and the way this works in the US is then you have to specify regulations and then interpretations of the regulations. So there's like 3 different levels of lobbying: the original drafting, then the rules, and then the interpretation of the rules. And in this case, everything hinges on how you implement the IRA rules, because there are huge subsidies, you're absolutely right, but whether or not you give them to firms depends on how you count green hydrogen production, and that can depend on the time of day at which you suck down the green electricity, the fact that it has to be additive, that you add new green power capacity, that it's closely matched geographically, so you're not sort of claiming some green power from somewhere else in the US. And the rules which the Biden administration, to my mind, to its credit, have pushed, insist on a tough interpretation on all of those counts, and that does indeed crimp the excitement in the industry over the benefits the IRA was going to provide. And one of the interesting things is the American Petroleum Institute and the Chamber of Commerce have both come out in defense of the IRA against potential repeal by the Trump administration or a Republican Congress. I think in part because they would like to go down the route suggested by the questioner, which is, hey, if we could ease up on these regulations, this would actually become a really, really major support for various types of hydrogen experiment within the fossil fuel industry. Now, how you evaluate that depends on your overall vision of where you think hydrogen fits in the green energy transition, and because I'm broadly a skeptic on that, especially the idea of large-scale export, I am more in favor of holding the line on those regulations. But if we are in a Trump scenario next year, and this is a way of maintaining some of the coalition that sustained IRA, it's the kind of compromise we may need to think about. But your question is great because it exposes the complexity of these decisions. So we had World Bank, IRA.
At this point, seems like a game, some sort of game show at this point. What do we have left? What was I think, or have they just kind of slipped between the cracks at this point? I don't know if we'll recover them.
There were more. Okay, maybe.
Yeah, maybe you can approach us, and whoever's question we failed to answer. I feel like that was a pretty I think fair to say a pretty impressive run right now on all those questions. I should say, thank you to everyone for being part of this discussion and part of this, our conversation that we have with each other every week. I specifically want to say thank you to the boy Sam, if I recall his name, 9-year-old here in the audience who we met before the show, a 9-year-old listener who came out tonight. Very impressive.
We need the youth league of ones and twos, don't we?
A youth fan club. Yeah, no. Above all, I'm going to make my own son feel bad for not listening. Is what I'm going to do. I'm going to cite him. I'm going to say, "There's a 9-year-old boy listening to this show. You're not keeping up." But otherwise, I would like to thank everyone else who helped make this happen. Sixth and I Synagogue, beautiful venue, Foreign Policy Magazine, of course, Adam, and thank again to all of you for coming out. Hopefully see you all again soon.
Thank you to Adam and Cam. Please stay seated while our guests make their way backstage. If you purchase a drink, please dispose of your reusable cups, and you can dispose of anything actually in the yellow bins that are at the exits on your way out. We appreciate your help with our sustainability efforts. Additional books by both authors are for sale in the lobby, so please go and pick up your books there. And we really hope to see you back here at 6 and I soon. Thanks so much for coming, everyone.